During this lecture, we will cover diseases of the digestive system. Gastrointestinal diseases are so common. We have probably all at least once experienced firsthand the signs and symptoms that accompany gastrointestinal diseases, so diarrhea, vomiting, and abdominal discomfort. And most often we kind of associate gastrointestinal diseases with foodborne illnesses, but we're going to see that not all gastrointestinal diseases are foodborne. But we do most often think of it that way. We think of cross-contamination and practicing unsafe food handling, like crossing raw meat with fruits and veggies. I do like to mention here E. coli. We kind of always think of E. coli, I think, also in terms of gastrointestinal diseases, but lots of E. coli are really good in your digestive tract. It's part of your normal microbiota, as we'll see soon. But there is bad E. coli as well, and this is one of the bad ones. So Escherichia coli and then the serotype O157H7 leads to very serious gastrointestinal distress. And this is something that can occur by eating undercooked meat, because this type of E. coli, even though it causes gastrointestinal distress for us, it can just hang out asymptomatically in the intestines of cows. And then when those cows are processed and then that meat that came from that cow is undercooked, that can then be ingested by us and lead to some very serious infections. So as I mentioned, not all types of gastrointestinal diseases are foodborne, but the majority of them are. So since Escherichia coli O157H7 outbreaks have been tracked, you can see that the number of outbreaks since like 1982 and so on, the majority of these are foodborne illnesses. Some are also going to be waterborne from contaminated water, contact with animals, person to person. Like all of these are different ways that E. coli can be transmitted to a new host, but the majority of them are going to be foodborne outbreaks. A little bit about the anatomy of the digestive system. So your digestive system is also referred to as your gastrointestinal tract or your GI tract. So all of these are interchangeable. Your digestive system begins at your mouth and then ends at your anus. And so it includes all of these structures in between as well. So all parts of the mouth are included in the digestive system. So it'd be like your gums and lips and teeth and tongue and everything. And we'll talk more about your mouth on the next slide. And it also includes your pharynx or your throat, and then your esophagus, which goes down to your stomach, your small intestine, your large intestine, and your rectum. And like I said, the mouth is included in your digestive system whenever we talk about your digestive system, because food, of course, has to come in through your mouth and then go down your esophagus. And so whenever we talk about the digestive system, we also end up talking about dental and oral diseases, and so we'll talk a little bit about that in this lecture as well. So you have ingested food, you've chewed it up in your mouth, and digestion starts in the mouth. You have digestive enzymes that are in your saliva, starts breaking down the food, goes down your esophagus, goes to your stomach, makes it all the way to your small intestine. And the small intestine is where all of this nutrient absorption is happening. The primary way that you're getting nutrients from food is as it's traveling through the small intestine. And I wanted to point out the important structures of the small intestine that allow you to absorb those nutrients that are in your food. So the small intestine has this interesting structure, and it's kind of wavy like this. You can see this micrograph of a cross section of the intestinal lumen right here. It's all wavy down here. And these are called villi, so these are projections. And each of these cells that make up the villi, if you zoom in on it, also have microvilli, so small extensions on the surface of each cell. And what this is doing in the small intestine is increasing the surface area a lot. And so with all that increased surface area, that means the food that you've ingested can make contact with the lumen of your small intestine and absorb those nutrients. And so we'll see that diseases that impact your small intestine and impact your ability to absorb nutrients is really detrimental to your health and your ability to get nutrients out of your food. So the normal microbiota of our digestive system is really important. We have lots of microbes that hang out in our digestive system, starting at the oral cavity, and then there are so many microbes in the colon or the large intestine. This is where the vast majority, largest concentration of microbes exist in the digestive system. And many people consider the gut microbiota to be its own organ because it is so essential for so many processes inside your body. But you can also think of the digestive system as a pretty harsh environment. So you have the stomach that has stomach acid, of course. You have the chewing of food. You're mashing things down. It's a pretty harsh environment. So why is that? Well, a couple reasons, of course. So first, that harsh environment is going to help with digestion. That stomach acid is going to help break down food. Chewing your food is going to help break it down along with those digestive enzymes in your saliva. And also, it helps out your immune system. So that means potential pathogens that you are ingesting are being broken down and destroyed in the stomach acid. So that harsh environment helps get rid of and reduce that microbial load a little bit. The large intestine or colon, like I said, has the most diverse and abundant microbiota. And that's going to have a lot of Clostridium and Bacteroides genera. It's also going to have plenty of other types of bacteria and also fungi you have in your normal microbiota of your digestive system as well. You have bifidobacteria, and this type of bacteria is going to be really essential for getting certain vitamins, and it's going to produce these vitamins for you that you're not able to produce on your own. So like vitamin B12 and riboflavin. You also have many types of very important E. coli in your digestive system and your colon. And E. coli is really important and essential for vitamin K production. So again, without your normal microbiota, you would not be able to produce these essential vitamins. You have bacteria that are producing these for you. Some terminology for different signs and symptoms of oral and GI diseases, because the mouth is considered part of the gastrointestinal tract. So first off, not all GI diseases are caused by foodborne pathogens. So you can experience gastrointestinal illness without ingesting a foodborne pathogen. Periodontal disease, this is going to be chronic inflammation and erosion of the gums. So bacteria can cause tooth decay and cavities, and we'll talk about that on the next few slides and talk about how tooth decay and dental caries or cavities are caused by this bacteria in your mouth that is not being kept in check. And then you have ulcers. These are open sores in the mouth or the GI tract, and we'll talk about a specific type of bacteria that causes stomach ulcers. Infections and intoxications of the lower GI tract. So this is going to cause those classic signs and symptoms of gastrointestinal diseases, so vomiting, diarrhea, and fever. And we'll talk a little bit later on about the difference between infections and intoxications. Gastritis, this is inflammation of the stomach lining. Enteritis, inflammation of the intestinal mucosa. And colitis is the inflammation of the colon. And a specific type of colitis, whenever you actually experience watery and bloody stools, so specifically blood in the stool, this is from damage to the epithelial cells that are in the colon, and this is called dysentery. So for dysentery, the presence of blood has to be there because then you know that there's actual damage to those cells in the colon. Microbial diseases of the mouth. And so the first thing that comes to mind should definitely be cavities. So we may have all had a cavity at some point. If not, great job with your dental health. But cavities are also called dental caries, so that's interchangeable. And cavities are actual lesions on teeth and decay on a tooth that's caused by microbes. So that tooth decay is the result of metabolic activity of microbes hanging out on your teeth. So you eat stuff throughout the day, right? You're eating sugary things and all of that, and you have bacteria in your mouth that are like, oh great, you're eating stuff, I'm going to eat stuff too. It's going to digest those sugars, break them down, produce acidic byproducts that are then going to break down and erode that enamel on your tooth and cause that decay. And then you can have the development of plaque on your teeth. So whenever you go to the dentist and they take out those tooth scrapers and they're scraping off the plaque from that teeth, they're scraping off biofilm. So that is biofilm that has formed on your teeth. And we have already learned that biofilm is super resilient and difficult to get rid of. So that's why the dentist is actually scraping and mechanically removing that biofilm, because it's really difficult to get rid of. You can't, once it gets to a certain point, you can't just brush it away anymore. It has to be mechanically removed. The most common bacteria that's going to cause dental caries or cavities in your mouth is Streptococcus mutans. So we all have this bacteria, just part of our normal microbiota in our mouth, and we try not to let it over proliferate and overgrow by having good dental hygiene and brushing our teeth. So gum health is very important as well. Gingivitis is the inflammation of the gums, and this can lead to irritation and bleeding. If your gums bleed while you're brushing your teeth, you may have gingivitis, and that is reversible by just flossing and improving your gum health and removing that excess bacteria that's leading to that inflammation. But chronic gingivitis or untreated gingivitis over time can develop into something more serious called periodontitis. And then when this happens, you actually have the receding of the gums and exposure of the tooth below the crown. So the crown is this top kind of white, thick enamel part, and then below that you can have the recession of these gums as this inflammation worsens and as this bacteria kind of reaches in and gets down on either side of the tooth and erodes the tooth from either side. So that can potentially then reach the root of the tooth, and each tooth has a blood supply. So if this bacteria actually reaches all the way to the root, it can potentially get into the bloodstream from your tooth and lead to bacteremia and bacteria in the bloodstream. Now we'll talk about some examples of bacterial infections of the GI tract. And foodborne diseases, as we'll see, can be the result of an infection or an intoxication. An infection is going to be when a microbe is ingested and the actual microbe colonizes the gut and starts producing toxins. So you've ingested the microbe replicates, makes more of itself, proliferates, and colonizes the gut. The difference here is intoxication. You are ingesting toxins that the bacteria has produced in food. So you aren't necessarily ingesting the bacteria, you are ingesting a toxin that bacteria produced in the food before you ate it. And then how are the classic signs and symptoms of these types of infections? Trying to help your body and immune system. So you have diarrhea, you have vomiting, and of course that's your body's attempt to clear you of the infection. It's trying to remove as much of this bacteria as possible through those routes. Most bacterial GI illnesses are going to be self-limiting. So within a few days, you will feel better. But that, of course, I always like to mention, that is not always the case for people that are immunocompromised or people that are very young or very old. These diseases can be very detrimental to their health. It can be very damaging to their immune system, and it can really lead easily to things like dehydration. Now, staphylococcal food poisoning. And we're back to Staphylococcus aureus. We've talked about this type of bacteria multiple times now. And this is going to be an example of food intoxication. So ingesting a toxin that Staphylococcus aureus has produced, specifically an enterotoxin. And the signs and symptoms, and this is going to be nausea, vomiting, abdominal discomfort, is usually going to resolve within 24 to 48 hours of onset. But if someone is immunocompromised or weak, then it could be a lot less self-limiting. Usually this is going to be associated with raw or undercooked foods or dairy products, and it's often from these foods being left at temperatures that are in the danger zone, so below 140 degrees Fahrenheit and above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, or refrigerator temperature, because this allows a Staphylococcus aureus to grow in this temperature. Because remember, Staphylococcus aureus is a mesophile, so it likes kind of body temperature. So left in this danger zone, it's able to replicate, make more of itself, and as it's making more of itself, it's secreting this enterotoxin into the food that you're about to eat. So you want to limit the amount of time that foods are in this danger zone. And how do you prevent these types of intoxications or infections? Of course, you practice food safety. you wash your hands, you prevent cross-contamination, and refrigerate foods promptly. That said, you should never put hot foods into the fridge. So you've probably all heard to let foods come to room temperature before putting it into the fridge, and that's also very important, because if you put a very hot food into the fridge, now all of a sudden you're raising the temperature of the fridge, and now it's getting into the danger zone. Now it's not just your leftovers that are in the danger zone, it's your whole fridge. So make sure that you are aware of your fridge temperature and how long foods are in this danger zone. Now we have Salmonella entericia, and this causes salmonellosis or Salmonella gastroenteritis. And then there's also typhoid fever that's caused by a type of Salmonella. It's a subtype of Salmonella entericia, or it's also called Salmonella typhi. And this is part of normal gut microbiota. And so depending on the serotype, depending on the bacterial load or how much bacteria you're ingesting, depending on your host health, are you immunocompromised, it's all going to depend on whether or not you experience the gastroenteritis signs and symptoms of infection with this type of bacteria. Infection is going to be caused by contaminated foods, so eggshells and then certain animals. This is a common bacteria that is in the guts of chickens. So whenever they lay eggs and those eggs get in all of that chicken feces, salmonella can easily be transferred on the shells of eggs. This is easily prevented by hand washing and cooking foods properly. So this bacteria can't survive in high temps. So just cooking eggs to a proper temperature will kill all Salmonella entericia that is on that eggshell or got into the food after you cracked the egg. And then typhoid fever. Remember, we talked about typhoid fever briefly with Typhoid Mary, but typhoid fever is caused by this certain type of Salmonella entericia called typhi. And there is antibiotic treatment and vaccination available for typhoid fever. Next up, we have cholera. This is caused by the bacteria Vibrio cholera and other types of species of Vibrio, so most often it's going to be Vibrio cholera. There is an estimated 3 to 5 million cases of cholera each year and over 100,000 deaths each year, so it is definitely a very relevant infection. Vibrio cholera is motile, and they actually get through the intestinal mucosa and then attach to the epithelial cells. And then once they're attached, they release an enterotoxin. And this enterotoxin changes the osmosity in your intestine. And so it makes all of this water come into your intestine, and this leads to this rice water stool, diarrhea, and that altering of the osmotic pressure can lead to rapid dehydration because you are losing so much water. So much water is being pulled into your intestines. This is most often going to be self-limiting. Often, if you are getting treatment for it, it's going to be rehydration treatment to keep you hydrated until your immune system can clear the infection. And this is going to be through the fecal-oral route. So Vibrio cholera is released through the feces, that contaminates water, and then it is ingested. And so this can be prevented by practicing good sanitation, sewage treatment, having clean water available, and that's easier said than done, right? Because there are parts of the world where that is a lot less accessible, and it's in those parts of the world that cholera is most prevalent. Now, peptic ulcers, and specifically talking about peptic ulcers that are caused by the bacteria Helicobacter pylori. So this is a major cause of peptic ulcers, so stomach ulcers. And it is also associated with developing stomach cancer in the future after developing these stomach ulcers. And many people have this bacteria just in your stomach. So 2/3 of the population actually has Helicobacter pylori. But whether or not they lead to an infection and actually start causing damage is not super well understood. So it could be related, of course, to your immune system and how well your immune system is working, but it could also be related to a lot of other factors, genetic factors and stress factors. Helicobacter pylori is really interesting because it can actually tolerate those acidic environments in your stomach. For the most part, bacteria gets to your stomach acid and it just gets killed. But with Helicobacter pylori, it's actually able to release this special enzyme called urease, and this neutralizes the stomach acid. So this allows Helicobacter pylori to actually colonize these epithelial cells that are lining your stomach and attach and start to proliferate. It uses this special type of pili to attach to those cells, and then whenever it does attach, that's when it starts releasing these exotoxins that are damaging this intestinal lining. Antibiotics can be used to treat this infection, and we'll talk on the next slide a little bit about the scientist that discovered this, that actually discovered that peptic ulcers were in fact most likely caused by this bacteria, Helicobacter pylori. Dr. Barry Marshall is the researcher who actually discovered that peptic ulcers that are caused by Helicobacter pylori can be cured with antibiotics. So you can actually clear the infection and treat these ulcers with antibiotics. And so he knew this was the case, but of course it's very difficult to test on humans, as it should be. It's very difficult to get to that point in research where you're doing human testing, and so he tested on himself. So he drank the bacteria, he infected himself with Helicobacter pylori, developed stomach ulcers, and then treated himself with antibiotics. And then he went on to actually win the Nobel Prize for that. So fantastic, Dr. Barry J. Marshall. Now, Clostridium difficile, or Clostridoides difficile, or C. diff. If you work in a healthcare setting or you're doing something in the healthcare field, you've probably heard of a C. diff infection. This is very relevant as a nosocomial infection and happens in hospital settings frequently. So C. diff can be part of our normal microbiota, and so it's common in people that are immunocompromised or have weakened immune systems, and this acts as an opportunistic pathogen. So this is common in immunocompromised patients in hospitals, especially when they are in that healthcare setting for an extended period of time, when they've taken antibiotics recently or are on a long antibiotic regimen, or if they've had some kind of gastrointestinal procedure that's damaging their intestinal lining, their intestinal mucosa, or just damaging the diversity of their gut microbiota. And think about this in terms of antibiotics. So antibiotics kill bacteria, right? But antibiotics don't necessarily know what all of your good bacteria are in your gut and then what all the bad bacteria are. So there's a lot of damage just happening to the diversity of your gut microbiota, especially if you're taking antibiotics over a long period of time. You're really decreasing the microbial diversity, opening up all the space and nutrients for Clostridium difficile to proliferate and grow and cause an infection. And this is called antibiotic-associated diarrhea. And this is when your normal microbiota is disrupted, and this lets C. diff grow and proliferate. C. diff produces two types of enterotoxins that cause cell death, and this can lead to necrosis of tissue and ulceration. And this can ultimately lead to septicemia and death because these ulcers can kind of eat through that lining and then lead to the dissemination of this bacteria in your bloodstream. The first step for treatment is to stop antibiotics or really lower the antibiotic regimen to kind of help your normal microbiota get back to what it should be. And also, if you've never heard of it before, a really fascinating treatment for C. diff infections is something called fecal transplants, and this is a very effective treatment. So this is when you have someone that is healthy, that has good gut microbiota, and they act as a donor, and you actually collect a fecal sample, and that fecal sample has all the diversity of their gut microbiota in that sample. That sample is then processed, and that good microbiota can be transferred to you. There's things called poop pills. They're really called that. They can be ingested through the mouth, or they can be given through the nasal cavity, and they can make it their way to your intestines, or they can be delivered through a colonoscopy. And what that is doing is just reintroducing good bacteria to your digestive system in order to stop the overgrowth of this C. diff. And that might sound funny or gross or anything like that, but it really is an amazing treatment, an amazing therapy, and it really is extremely effective, especially since you probably take prebiotics and probiotics, right? And so that's doing a very similar thing of repopulating and helping the growth of your good microbiota in your gut. Now we'll talk about a couple examples of viral infections of the GI tract. And worldwide, diarrhea is the second leading cause for death for children under 5. Diarrhea, right? It sounds so common, but for children under 5, diarrhea can quickly lead to very serious dehydration because they have such small bodies. All of that water loss can be very detrimental. So diarrhea is very serious in young children. 70% of childhood gastroenteritis is viral, so viral gastroenteritis is more common than bacterial gastroenteritis. And we'll see that the two most common viruses that are associated with gastrointestinal diseases in children are rotavirus and norovirus. Rotavirus is the most common cause for diarrhea, widespread in children, kind of worldwide. 95% of children have had at least one rotavirus infection in their life. And this is going to be primarily an infection that develops in poorer countries, so countries that don't have access to sanitation or to clean drinking water, because it is transmitted via the fecal oral route. So countries that don't have access to clean water and the water that they do use is contaminated by fecal matter, it's much more likely for this to be transmitted throughout the population. Illness can cause severe fluid loss, so that's from the diarrhea. And without any supportive treatment available or without access to clean water, it can lead to death. There is a preventative vaccine available. So there is a rotavirus vaccine, and that's part of the World Health Organization's standard vaccine schedule. And this vaccine is fantastic and has, of course, decreased the incidence of rotavirus infection in many populations. But to make this extremely effective, of course, it needs to be accessible and rolled out to all populations. And by that, I mean that vaccinations in some parts of the world are less accessible than we're used to. We are very fortunate to have access to very good health care and vaccine accessibility. But you can see here, for example, this graph on the bottom, areas of Africa where rotavirus mortality is still pretty high in terms of what we're seeing in the United States. Of course, this is 2017, but this is why rolling out vaccines and making them more accessible to different parts of the world is so important. And the impact of the rotavirus vaccine hasn't really been fully realized in Africa yet. Of course, it has been rolled out here, but this is a lot of area to cover and a lot of people to cover. And coming up with a vaccine schedule and making it accessible to people here is extremely important, along with making clean water and sanitary conditions accessible as well. Finally, we'll talk about one example of a protozoan infection of the GI tract. Although protozoans can be part of our normal microbiota too, there are parasitic protozoans that cause infection. Most often, these types of infections are going to occur from ingesting contaminated food or water. So the example that we're looking at here is Giardia lamblia, and this causes giardiasis. So it's also called backpacker's diarrhea. Commonly, you get it if you drink from a stream or something. Whenever you're out backpacking, you forget your water bottle, you can easily pick up this protist in that water. And these are not little eyeballs that it has right here. These are actually the adhesive discs that it uses to attach to your intestinal mucosa. And we'll see on the next slide kind of what that looks like. But it attaches to the intestinal mucosa. And your intestine is important for absorbing nutrients from food. So it can potentially block the absorption of nutrients and block the absorption of fats, leading to very fatty, kind of watery stools. But in most cases, this is going to be self-limiting, and your immune system is going to take care of it for you. On the left here, we have a micrograph showing how Giardia lamblia does attach to the intestinal wall and prevent nutrient and fat absorption. And then on the right here, it has a very simple life cycle, but it kind of just shows the cycle. And this is transmitted via the fecal oral route. So cysts and the trophozoites are passed in the stool, and trophozoites can't survive in the environment and they die, but they can be used as a diagnostic tool. So with a stool sample, you can observe for the presence of cysts and trophozoites to diagnose this. But then it is the cysts that can then contaminate food and water and then be ingested by someone, which can lead to infection.